Okay, so this is the end of part 3, the beginning of part 4, in one of the most strategic and logical videos you're probably ever going to see, because this is what you will call advanced automotive electrical repair or fabrication. The reason I say it's strategic is because there's more than one way for layering out this wiring harness. Like, for example, we're trying to move that harness over there that was cut from the main. We're trying to move it here. And the reason I say it's logistic, it's because it's mostly rely on you and your method and way of thinking. Well, that will help you once you have a testing tool like we have there. And also you're going to need that tape and a book with a pencil to note everything that you're going to be learning, because the book is the best place you're going to be able to reference your idea and how you're going to strategize your approach to accomplish the goal of getting this harness to start the VQ35DE engine from the Nissan R50 Pathfinder 2002 year model. The most important factor about this harness in relation to the conversion is that this harness came with the engine and so did the ECU. So this is more preferable to use with the engine, since it has additional harness that are required to connect to this harness. The other harness, which is saw in the previous video, do not have those extension harness. Mismatching extension harness from other application is one of the biggest mistakes, leading to faulty operation or no start condition. This is the last part of preparing this harness for installation, and in this last part we want to take a look at this juncture right here, which will go to the main harness into the Nissan Frontier D22 main harness for fuse distribution, gauge cluster, evap, ground, transmission control module, and other device circuitry application. Mismatching extension harness from other application into your current conversion must be identified and tested to confirm that it is within the circuitry of the vehicle service manual or the engine service manual ECU wire blueprint. Our final but not last part in this video for conversion of the wire harness to the Nissan Frontier D22 main harness, that will be this harness right here. This is basically the new main harness with that one up there to enter the vehicle, where the original Nissan VQ35DE engine ECU wiring harness is connected to the very same main harness. These two harness will have to transform and unite itself with the vehicle for proper circuit operation, which meets factory specification and circuit network standards. Let's begin tracing those wires in the harness circuitry network to figure out what they could possibly be for, which device in the vehicle require this circuit for the vehicle to perform like the factory recommend it should. Before we can start pinpointing all the terminal in the ECU harness plug, let's take a look at this drawing that was made up based on the color of the wire for the pin in the ECU harness. Also, color placement was placed onto the ECU. You will notice these red dots signifying a live wire in that location. We have a total of 70 wires connecting into the back of the harness plug. And here are the location with the pin number specified. You will have to make note of all these distinctions inside of the harness to reference them later on. Since we are not confirmed as to where this wiring harness came from based on the eBay seller most extraordinary advertisement of stating it to be a 2000 to 2004 Nissan Pathfinder QX4, we are going to look at the Nissan Pathfinder service manual for year 2000, 2001, 2001 and a half, 2002, and 2003. A look at the 2000 year model Pathfinder wiring schematic for the main power supply and ground circuit. We will notice the ignition switch, which is the circuit we want to keep our focus onto. And when we scroll down, we will see that circuit enters at pin number 31. But when we look at the ECU, we can see it's not identical. So we will disregard this blueprint as a source for our information and continue with the 2001. We're going to look at the same ignition circuit. And when we look at this circuit, we could see it enters at pin 43, and the ECU is most identical as to the one we have. So we're going to keep that in mind, that the power circuit from the ignition switch is on terminal number 43. We will now return to 2001 and a half year, make, and model. So here we see the ignition switch. This is a fuse box. It goes into the ECU at the same pin, number 43. And when we look at the harness, it's also the same. Now we will go to 2002, and right away we can see the ECU harness is the same, and the power distribution is in pin 43 for that circuit on the ignition switch. So we have basically located 3 years that are identical, which is the 2001, 2001 and a half, and 2002. So basically 2 years we have found that the ECU harness is identical at the ECU pin terminal. When we take a look at the 2003 Nissan Pathfinder Workshop Service Manual, we want to look at that same circuit with the ignition switch. As we stroll down, right away we're going to see the ECU harness plug is most different. So we will disregard this 2003 Nissan Pathfinder Service Manual for the wiring blueprint. We are consulting with Pathfinder harness because we do not know the harness which is before us origin. Before us here is the 2002 year model Pathfinder wiring harness. So we're going to stay on track with this same circuit that we're investigating that comes from the ignition switch. It's a power distribution circuit, and we can see it enters at pin number 43. So we have to go and investigate pin number 43 on the physical harness because in the service manual for 3 series or 2 years, this power circuit is identical. When we take a look at pin number 43 as specified by the Pathfinder manual, we could see it says blue and black wire. Let's take a look at that wire on the ECU harness plug. Okay, we will now identify pin 43 on the ECU harness plug. When we flip that harness plug around, we're going to find that wire to be this blue and black wire like we specify in the book. We'll then follow this wire by pulling on it. And we can see that wire is right here. So this wire will most likely be a power distribution from the ignition switch as the Nissan Pathfinder service manual specify. Let's have a look at the second circuit that we want to pin out on the ECU harness. That will be this wire here that basically distribute off the ECU relay and a main fuse in the engine compartment. When we scroll down and take a look at what pin that wire entered, that's pin number 12. So we will go and look at pin number 12. Here we can locate pin number 12, and the color for pin number 12 is basically a white wire. When we take a look at pin number 12, that's the second wire right here. This wire ends up at the crankshaft position sensor shield wire. So right away, this has already told us that the wiring schematic for this 2002 Nissan Pathfinder will not be sufficient to providing all the information that we need for sorting out the circuit in the wiring harness to be wired into the main harness for the 2003 Nissan Frontier. Now we have to go and find the year and make model that best matches this harness wiring color and pin layout for accurate information before we can install this wiring harness. Let's take a look at another circuit on this blueprint schematic. That will be number 67. We want to see if this circuit is identical to the one in the wiring harness. So we can see number 67 is right here. We go up here, we see 67. We come down here, 67 tells us it's a blue and yellow wire. Now when we go up here, we see a blue and yellow wire, but when we follow this blue and yellow wire, it continues into the harness here, and it travels on down into the harness. So right away, we know this is not a identical circuit as specified in this manual, because pin number 67 would end up at a power distribution on the wiring circuit manual. It is most difficult working with these devices. It's better if you could have the book before you. It makes your gluing the whole circuitry together much easier. When we continue and take a look at that same 2002 Nissan Pathfinder shop service manual, these 3 pins that we have identified already, pin number 43, 12, and 67, showed up on this harness, which is a JDM harness, also show up in the same routing for this harness, which is the JDM Pathfinder harness that we purchased from the fella in Long Island, New York. For example, when we look at pin number 67, we will see this blue and yellow wire which continues down the harness. When we go to that same location, we will see another blue and yellow wire that continues down the harness. When we move to pin number, this will be pin number 12, this is the second white wire in. That wire goes to the crankshaft position sensor. Then when we look at that same wire on this blue harness, this blue harness here, it shows up as a green wire, and this wire also goes in to the crankshaft position sensor. You can see it comes up right here. So the wiring routing or route or the line of travel for the wire is the same in both of these harnesses. That one up there, as we have specified before, is the JDM harness that came with the engine. And this one is what we purchased from the fellow in Long Island. And he specified it as a Pathfinder 2002 year model, but it does not shows up to be that way because the color does not match our specification as stated in this diagram here. So this is when you have a lot of salesmen lying to you or just telling you story or trying to throw you off. You always have to rely on the factory manual specification, and you cannot take anybody's word for it. For example, if I was doing this video and did not show you this factory service manual wiring blueprint, then I will be most likely portraying a deception on my end for you to buy. That blue and yellow wire that travels down the harness basically end up at the evap purge volume solenoid. Is a blue and yellow wire signifying that is in the same circuit as this pin with the same blue and yellow wire. So this has basically told us that both of these harnesses are routed the same way but may have different wire colors. Now that we know that the wires for both of these harnesses go in the same direction and location, they're still not identical to this shop service manual, which is 2002 Nissan Pathfinder, because these two wires are showing for power distribution, and in our harness at pin number 12 on both ECU harness is routed to the crankshaft position sensor and evap. Let's take a look at the uniform color of the wire as they display from the top of the ECU plug. That will be subconnector blue, green, and white. So we can see the wire color are most different. But when we take a look at the side, these two side connectors, we'll see they are white, and these two side connectors, the top one is black and white, and the bottom one is black and white also. Basically, we can see we have more wire in this top stack of the 2002 Nissan Pathfinder that we received from the USA, and this one here we can see we have less wire on the top stack, which is the JDM wiring harness that came with the engine. Since both of those wiring harness may display different color wire at the same pin locator and sometimes display different colors, or sometimes the pins may not be in location, we will now have to move to the Pathfinder main harness. We have to look at the plug inside of the ECU wiring schematic and basically identify the wires that are entering the ECU on both of these harnesses from the main harness connection. The most important wiring that we're looking for is the wire that goes to the transmission control module. That is the most important wire. If we cannot identify those wires, then we will not be able to drive the vehicle. So, even though we have most of the sensors on the wiring harness for basically both the US, and the JDM, but we both know that both of them is a JDM harness because the factory service manual has already specified a different profile or type ECU harness when compared to this one and this one. Here you will notice some of the wires have already been labeled based on identifying them on this main harness, which is the same JDM harness, but the colors are in some case close to identical, but we physically compare and inspect both of these harnesses by looking at the wire and where it traveled in the circuit or the harness, and then determine what that wire could possibly be by making various comparisons from various make and model ECU that looks the same as the JDM. We must always remember when we are comparing our wiring harness and color pin location, the ECU harness plug must look identical. We will take a look at these remaining unlabeled wire in this main harness, identifying them, following them to the location on the ECU. Then we will pick up that location from the ECU, follow that wire, and most likely it will enter in these existing unlabeled wire. Then that wire can be tagged based on the information that we receive over here about this wire from the vehicle factory service manual, referring it to these main harnesses for labeling for future referencing. We will do this with all of the wires in this main harness plug until we could do a process of elimination by getting rid of most of the wires, which will leave us with a few, and that will requiring comparison onto the 2003 Nissan Frontier D22 main harness. We can now bring ourselves to the understanding that both of these harnesses are the same because we have found two of the circuit to be at the same terminal location for the ECU. But these two harnesses are most different from the factory service manual that we have referenced to before. Based upon two of the circuit being identical in this harness, we will continue and check other circuits to confirm that they are also identical, and that will be a good assumption to use this main harness plug wiring and labeling method as a source for pinpointing the origin of these wires for the unknown harness. We must come to the understanding that we are identifying these pin location based on the origin of the sensor and the main plug harness from the one that came with it. We are not using the factory service manual wiring blueprint schematic to identify the pin location. We are just using that schematic for verifying the circuit relation to the sensor because the pin and wire color are different. Once labeling and identifying the wire for these main harness, it should be transferred onto a notepad so it can now be referenced with the wiring diagram for the 2003 Nissan Frontier D22 main harness. This harness will be under the dashboard and will also have 3 plugs like this that's associated with ECU. In the notebook, you will notice a space to the right that was purposed for placing additional information relating to this circuit, where and when it should be merged. Once a sketch or notation has been taken of those main harness 3 connector, we will then move to the vehicle of conversion, which is the 2003 Nissan V22 VG33E main harness. We basically want to make a sketch drawing of all the sockets, labeling its pin and identifying them for future reference with this main harness and its notation.